We're ready to go. Hi. I'm going to read Jeremy's bio out loud. No. My name is Cynthia Nguyen. I'm the chair of the graphic design program. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Most of you know Jeremy's work and his accomplishments well, but just in case, you now have his very modest bio, a brief summary of the Rome Prize and its selection process. So, in your hands. I don't normally do this, but since I've known him for 10 years, I want to say just a few words before I give up the podium. I am in constant awe at the way he thinks and what he can do. I think he's got this innate sensibility and aesthetics that's incredible. I've enjoyed every single conversation with him, and like his work, it generally leaves you to think a little bit longer and just a little bit bigger and hope for a little more. So tonight, I am very proud to introduce my friend, an amazing designer, a fabulous teacher, a recipient of the Rome Prize, and someone I'm very lucky to be in company of. So there he is.
Thank you, Cynthia, and the same to you on all the accolades. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Do I need this microphone? Yeah. Okay. Then I will use it. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. It's a little odd to give a lecture to people you know quite well. I think I know, and I can't even see you. You can see me. But it's weird to give a lecture to people who know you and know you both as a someone who makes design, but also just as a person. And so it was definitely something, a rare opportunity, but something with a little bit of anxiety to put this presentation together. It's called Rome and Other Stories. And really what I'm going to talk about are my work before Rome, the proposal that I put together to go to Rome, the work I did there, and then the implications of that work for me as a creative individual going forward. This is not news to people. I run a studio here called Mende Design, and we do a lot of different kinds of work. We do some editorial concept design. We do a fair amount of work for nonprofit organizations. This is something for Public Architecture's 1% program. We get some very large national campaigns periodically, and this was for Miss America 2006. We were hired by Country Music Television to do a national campaign for this, and this is what it looked like in Times Square. And I think that I can say that I'm the only designer at CCA who's had work in the National Enquirer. We do also some interiors work, and this is a project that I collaborated on with Todd Foreman from Public Design. And this was an interior project for Virgin America. What's interesting was that I was giving a lecture and kind of showing my work to some people, and some students were in the room, and a student said, do you ever do creative projects outside of the design work that you do? And I thought, I have a knee-jerk reaction to that, which is like, yeah, this is all my work, and everything I do has some part of me in it. But we have these more experimental projects that we do where we are thinking about form in different ways, and what would it be like instead of pushing pixels if we actually constructed the graphics and it was more like an installation project? Or what would it be like if we treated graphics more like a painter would or a sculptor, where we were sort of sculpting form and less interested in the kind of semiotic math of how you put a message together. This was a piece where form is really presented as content, and it's this kind of very nuanced and delicate work of graphic design. But I have to say that that question, do you do creative projects outside of work? It stuck with me, and I thought, I used to do a lot of different kinds of work, a lot of different kinds of creativity, and sometimes it does disturb me a bit that there always has to be a client before I produce something. And what is that arrangement really all about? Why is design always an accessory or a tool, and it's not the primary thing? And with that in mind, I sort of asked myself the question, what is my work at the end of the day? And as I said, I think back to projects where I was very interested in photography for a long time, and I would do some large format photography work, which is an art. I'm not an artist as a photographer by any stretch of the imagination, but it is an art unto itself. I would look for things that had these sort of accidental truthfulness to them when you separated them from their environment. And sometimes I wondered if the props that we were making to make design, I wondered if the experience of them in real time and real space might be more interesting than the way we were translating them into images. And it's funny, it dawned on me, it should have dawned on me a long time ago, why I have such a non-functional website. I don't know if any of you have gone to look at my work there, which you cannot see. I'm never comfortable with how graphic design is represented, valued, and consumed. I'm not comfortable with that arrangement. And when you produce a site that says, here's our branding work, or here's our interiors work, or here's our poster work, that's what it becomes. It becomes a kind of series of these isolated moments, and the process behind it, the craft, the thinking, the artfulness, all that stuff sort of goes away, and you end up with a kind of laundry list of graphic design projects. And so, thinking about this stuff, I thought, what kind of work would I make if I didn't have a client involved? Is that something that I need to jumpstart the creative process? And I think a lot of people who gravitate to design, myself included, are comfortable in that role. But what would it be like if I were to disrupt that role, or if I were to sort of try to step outside that role a little bit? And this idea interested me in the notion of a fellowship. It just so happens that I teach history of visual communications here at CCA, and I know that some students of mine are in the room. They should all be in the room, actually, because this will be quizzed on Friday. But I teach, I focus on early modernism to the present, but basically about 1850 to 1960 is the sweet spot of the class. And I'm interested in that time period because I think the great majority of the discoveries in terms of communication, form making, the idea of how to use sign systems to communicate, it's all been done and discovered, and that's the text you need to know, I think, to be an interesting practitioner these days. But when you study this, you come across the futurists. And for those of you who don't know them, it was an early modern Italian movement that began in 1909. And if you look at this piece was part of a body of work called Words in Freedom by F.T. Marinetti. And there are so many similarities in the way that typography and visible language is used as an expressive force to work that interests me and some of the things that I've been trying to do. And I think that work that interests a lot of people who are interested in experimental typography. But they had an agenda, and their agenda was to refuse the basic conventions of communication. If you could speak in a different way, if you could use poetry and visible language as a disruptive force, you could wake up a sleeping culture. And that was the idea of the futurists. They felt that Italy was falling very far behind the rest of Western Europe in the Industrial Revolution and modernism, and so they felt like that was their mission. They felt that they could produce a utopian world by the way that they would remake culture through language. This is the Futurist Manifesto, which was published. It's called the Founding Manifesto of Futurism, published by Marinetti in 1909. And he was a pretty canny guy. He understood that to be taken seriously, you couldn't publish your manifesto in an Italian newspaper because no one took Italy seriously as a cultural force. So he published it in Paris's newspaper, which was the creative publication, the one that covered all the arts that mattered. And not to make it a history lesson, but he was, in my opinion, the first contemporary, maybe first artist who understood how to manipulate the media. He knew that if he could get them to talk about what he was doing, he developed public relations. They would disseminate the text of what he was about, and that would have far more impact than what he could achieve on his own. But the important point about this manifesto is that it was radically optimistic. It was sort of a new age in terms of what the future could be about. And so one of the first things I did in looking at this is I did what I call the redacted Futurist Manifesto, and I eliminated all the text other than this sort of very short poetics that talks about their value system. And I think if you read through, you can see the tone of the movement and the values of it. Specifically, it was all about the new technology, collapsing time and space into an individual and ownable experience, denying history, and the almost sexual merging of man with machine. For them, the machine was the automobile. And as I was thinking about this work and thinking about how to craft it into a proposal, it occurred to me that if you distilled the Futurist Manifesto even further, you came away with these 5 basic ideas: industrialization, technology, speed, ego, and power. And looking at that list, I thought, that list is not so far away from the culture that we currently live in. The futurists talked about things like the wireless imagination. As I said, they talked about narrowing the gap between technology and the human form. And it occurred to me that 100 years after futurism, we're still dealing with those things. And in a way, I wondered if we might not be living the dream that the futurists were so optimistic about. I wondered if we were as optimistic about our future as they were about theirs. This is about 20 months ago, and I'm guessing that most people in the room have no idea what they were doing at 9:45 p.m. on April 20th. Maybe someone's raising their hand, but I can't see you, so... That is the day or the time that Deepwater Horizon exploded and sunk into the Gulf of Mexico. And I remember the experience of it quite well. For 3 months, there was round-the-clock news coverage, and we all saw those images of oil leaking out of that hole in the earth at the bottom of the ocean. And it reminded me of sort of like a clock. Every second of every day, there was a reminder of how something that we had created was essentially poisoning the environment that we lived in. And I felt that, optimism at this point becomes very difficult. And this could have been an image of Katrina, or it could have been an image of massive pollution, or it could have been an image of 7 billion people, or maybe 9 billion people in 15 years. It's a system pushed way beyond its carrying capacity, and I think we all know that. And so when I thought about this, I thought, maybe instead of the radical optimism that futurism presents, I wonder if we have something more about a certain kind of paradox. We are all aware of the precarious nature of our current existence, yet radical individualism, immediate access to things, convenience and consumption, that's essentially our way of life. And I think that contradiction produces in us something more of an anxious futurism. Maybe an anxious futurism is the end of futurism, the end of that kind of optimism. And so the proposal that I wrote and the thing that took me to Rome was really this idea, what would it be like to try to use the tools and techniques of visible language, typography, poetry, and try to use them as a disruptive force today? What would that look like, and what kind of work would I make with that idea? So I was lucky enough to win the Rome Prize and get to go to the American Academy in Rome. And this is the photo before I got on the plane to go to Rome. And I can tell you that this is a great feeling. Your life is packed into these little boxes. I had one giant monitor because I knew that that's what I would need, a couple bags, a photo printer, and that was it. And it's I mean, I don't want to advocate that you should pick up and leave your life tomorrow, but it's pretty good. So, if you're thinking about it, and I was able to kind of winnow my studio down to a skeleton crew and rented my apartment, sold my car. And like when you can take your key chain and it's only got like one key left on it, that's what you're looking for. So anyway, about a day later, I showed up here, which is the American Academy in Rome. This is the McKim, Mead, and White building. And this window here was my studio. And just to give you a little bit of background, it was founded in 1897, and the story goes that a bunch of wealthy American industrialists, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller Foundation, William Vanderbilt, the Carnegies, they were tired of essentially being upstaged by the French Academy in the Beaux-Arts tradition. And so the idea was that they would build an academy of their own, and they would send their architects there to train them in Beaux-Arts, and then they would come back to the U.S., and that's how we would have, like the Opera Hall here in California, in San Francisco, and buildings like that. So on the second day, this is the studio that I walked into, and it's about the same size as my studio here in San Francisco, but the ceilings are way higher, and it was just me. So this is a pretty intimidating moment. There's all this massive expanse of white walls, and the studio next to you is the one that was funded by Chuck Close, and so there's quite a legacy of people who've been through this place. And I think my first instinct was, okay, well, I got to start making work. I got to start putting something on these walls. And the first few experiments I was doing was just looking for symbols and relationships that would start to get at this idea of a kind of contemporary look at futurism, but maybe a more anxious look, a more sort of sanguine look into the future. And I made a number of different projects, something that sort of ironically celebrates maybe all the things that allow us to escape, or all the things that make, tools of denial, something like that. But as I was making this work, it felt sort of odd to me how subjective everything was. One of the things you don't have when you don't have a client is there's really little to push back on you, and all the decisions are yours. And so one of the things that those of us who teach graphic design always tell our students is if you get to the point where you're getting lost, choose some parameter, put some frame around what you're doing. And so what I decided to do was to take the Herald Tribune, which would show up every day, and I liked the idea of the newspaper because it was a document of that day. It was truthful to a point, and it was finite, and it represented that day individually, and it would never be repeated. And so I thought, okay, well, every day I'll take this, and I'll start looking for language, looking for accidental poetic fragments, looking for forms and images that I could maybe start to collage together. And it's interesting because the Futurists were the people who developed collage, in fact, before the Dadaists. And I started making these things. I would give myself sort of 4 hours a day and say, okay, set aside 4 hours a day, go through this exercise, make decisions, put it aside, be done with it. And they took on a lot of different forms. I wasn't that concerned with what the final product was. It was more just go through the exercise, let things happen, see what you can generate. And some of them I quite liked and still like. I think that there are some interesting ideas in there, but I wanted to push myself beyond, maybe ways of working that were comfortable for a graphic designer. And so I started doing a few other experiments. This is a number of rubbings I was doing. I was trying to extract typography from inscriptions that I would find around the Academy and around Rome. And I liked the idea of the rubbing as a kind of byproduct of the inscription, a sort of skin that gets sort of sloughed off. And at the same time, the detritus of all this technology that we consume, I thought there was an interesting parallel between these byproducts and representations of time and material and how they sort of came together. I was also, as we designers do, you kind of steal fragments of posters and billboards, and Rome has this stuff everywhere. So I was making these very large-scale collages where I was still dealing with this idea of ego and self-involvement and maybe the idea of a collapsing inward. In some cases, I would tie it all together, and again, I think, being a digitally facile designer, you can work in 2 and 3 dimensions and bring them together in the computer in one place. And it was getting kind of interesting. The newspaper work was suggesting these phrases. I was finding some forms and some images that were interesting to me. And then the computer was allowing me to kind of work with them in a very plastic way. And so that's how this work was kind of coming together. But oddly, I found sometimes that the byproducts, again, were more interesting than the more deliberate work. This is some pages of the newspaper with all the content eliminated, and all that's left are these shells or these husks. And I liked the sort of exhaustion that they suggest. It seemed fitting to me. But, the designer in me still has some questions, so this is what my studio looked like after a couple months. And, I've got a lot of experiments going. I'm looking at a number of different things. But I still wasn't clear who I was making this work for. It's important to me that what I make gets seen and doesn't sort of devolve into just sort of personal musings. It needs to go out in the world somehow, and how will it go out in the world? And these questions kept sort of nagging at me. I'm not an artist. I don't have a gallery. No one is saying, hey, when's your next show? Make some work for it. So if somehow presenting that work was important, I needed to develop a system that was going to work for that. We had this joke that Rome was the place down the hill. And the reason why we had that joke was that the Academy is literally on a hill, and you spend a lot of hours in your studio, you spend a lot of hours with other Americans. This is an illustration done by a guy named Marco Rapparelli, who was another fellow there. And there's something kind of very truthful about this, that unless you make an effort, you can spend your time in Rome basically sitting in a room on a hill. And so, a lot of us, it was pretty important to figure out how do we do what we're doing but integrate it into Rome, or get some back and forth between what we're doing and what's happening down there. And I think, the work I'm showing you, it was very delicate. It was very sort of considered. And when you think about the reality of Rome, it's not a very delicate place. It's busy, and it's weathered, and it's old, and it's also oddly new, and it has a lot of contradictions in its being a religious center, but also a very secular center, and the kind of odd proximity of personal and public space. And it kept annoying me that the work I was doing was not engaging this city somehow. When you walk around Rome, you see communication everywhere. It's probably the most written-on city that I've ever lived in. And whether it's an obelisk that was stolen from Egypt back in one of the empires, or whether it's a fascist piece of architecture, all these things had inscriptions on them. And some, like this, hugely monumental, which works with the sort of fascist understanding of society and politics. And some of them minuscule and sort of oddly detailed. This was a part of an inscription in a church somewhere. But the only contemporary communication that you'd see on the street was mostly advertising. And it surprised me. I mean, I look for graphic design to see, and in Italy, this is what they think graphic design is. It's advertising. It's on the street. The idea of design as a kind of sort of high watermark of introspection, that's not something that occupies a big place in Italian culture. Looking at these images periodically, I kept thinking, maybe there's an opportunity in this. Maybe there's a way to engage people by thinking about using this system. Could this be a viable place for design to live? And would the work that I was doing, would it function in this environment? I started to do some sort of simple experiments, and I started taking the work that I was making and I was inserting it back into the environment to see how it would work. Would it work? Would anyone notice it? Now, this is an interesting image because the two posters on the left, the big O's, that's an actual ad campaign. I don't know what for. And then the image on the right is my poster. And looking at this, it became really clear to me that if I wanted to work on the street, and the idea of being disruptive and being engaging, I would have to change the way I was thinking about the work I was making. These delicate, nuanced pieces that assume a fair degree of involvement and commitment from the viewer, it just wasn't going to happen. People walk by things quickly. They have to be engaged within a few seconds. And even when I was making visuals that were decidedly more shocking or geared towards being more shocking, they might grab someone's attention, but they lack involvement. They lack implication. I look at this and I think, yeah, it's cool, but it's insular. You're meant to look at it. It's not something that draws you into a dialogue or into a conversation. And that wasn't going to work for me. Even looking at things like this, where I was using typography in a really literal way, or in a more direct way, I should say, not literal. I think there's a certain amount of interest in this, but the game becomes, for the viewer, the decoding process becomes, what's the relationship between that phrase and that image? And so the poster takes on a kind of universe of its own, that the viewer tries to understand the significance of the choices made, as opposed to what that communication is to them, what their involvement is, or what their responsibility is towards that communication. And so as I was making this stuff, I thought, okay, I need to step back. I need to rethink either the task that I've set for myself, I need to change that, or I need to change the approach in the way that I'm attacking it. And so, I think this is another graphic design trick. When you get lost, make a diagram. It's not a bad trick, actually. And so what I did here was I tried to think about all the threads that I was trying to weave together into this project. There was this sense of anxiety that I think is background noise, and that we all experience to some degree or other based on our awareness. I felt that poetry was one of the futurist threads that made sense to carry forward. Expression would be typographic. Public space was something that I had decided was important to me. It had to have authority enough to stand out and to be not dismissed as some sort of whimsical project that had no relevance to the person seeing it. And it had to be implicative. It had to implicate you as the viewer. You had to understand that that communication was somehow including you in its sphere or in its scope. And so the project that I ultimately did there is called 100 Years From Now. And I worked with the Comune di Roma, the city government. I convinced them through many meetings, all in Italian, which I don't speak, so I had to have a translator with me, to give me 1,000 advertising spaces in Rome for 30 days. And in those spaces, I would insert a very simple idea. Something that you would see over and over again. Open-ended phrases with as little context as possible. The blankness attempting to work as a provocation, and something that in its crypticness demands to be made sense of. A label for the scene that it's a part of. And something that forces a decision to either confront it or ignore it. Really a kind of trigger, in a way, for mental images. Suggesting our relationship to time and time limits. Maybe our relationship with technology and the ever-narrowing space between us and technology. Our relationship to information and what we can believe as truth and who we can believe that message comes from. And the idea was that it would be something you would see over and over again in your journey through the city, so that I focused these things so that you would get 4 or 5 exposures through different pathways that you take through different zones of the city. The idea was to indicate or to somehow reference the thoughts that we already have but maybe don't want to allow to come to the surface. Something that refuses to solve itself. Simple but as disruptive as possible. And, the idea by doing it in real time and real space was to make it physical, to make it something that you couldn't, make it as difficult to ignore as possible. So it was confrontational. And so for 30 days in Rome, there were a flood of interpretations happening and kind of an atmosphere of interpretation. It occurred to me when I was putting the project together and thinking about how to install it and how I would do it that what about people who are really motivated to learn more? Is it okay to insert this thing into an environment that no one's asked for it? And do I have some responsibility to give someone who wants more information? The web makes that pretty easy to do these days. The difficulty was once you put a URL or a QR code or some other text on the poster, it ruins it. The poster then becomes in the service of something else. You're either driving traffic to a website, or you're selling something, or you're asking someone to look here so you can tell them to look over there. And I wanted these things to be pieces in and of themselves, these kind of hard print and physical objects that sort of sat in the environment. And so the way I solved that was I bought all the AdWords for all the phrases that were on the poster, so that if you had an IP address in Rome and you Googled the phrases, you would get an ad like the one at the top of the screen here. And if you click on the ad, it takes you to a website, And the site offers some simple, background information on the project. It sort of clarifies the project, not as advertising. And its real primary function, though, was to record the feedback, to record the comments and the interpretations that people had. And so, the comments were sort of all over the place. They really ran the gamut, but they fell into 4 or 5 categories. First, a very foreboding sense of what the future was going to be like. Maybe next, a much more hopeful sense of our ability to overcome and our ability to collectively, mount difficult odds. This one was sort of more of a purely technical comment, and I thought it was a very futurist comment, the idea that somehow the answer still lies in technology. And then this one was one that sort of stuck with me. I'll read it to you because it's in Italian. A real awareness of the human condition seems too slow and too biased. Civic consciousness of developed countries like Italy are almost entirely absent. Every day I see people privilege personal interests over collective ones. Talk of the environment mirrors this hypocrisy. Personally, I cannot easily see a happy future. Perhaps it will take an apocalyptic event to reestablish a proper hierarchy of values. And so this one maybe is even more frightening in its sense of resignation, that there's really nothing we can do, and it's going to take something, a deep water horizon on a massive scale before anyone's going to change their behavior. And this one I thought was interesting because it reminded us maybe that the responsibility lies more in the minute decisions we make every day, and that in those decisions we sort of make our present and make our future. And I thought that was maybe a good one for us all to remember. For me, it's not really about answers. It was about creating the experience. And for 1 month in Rome, people talked about these ideas. They confronted them. They voiced their desires, their hopes, their fears, their ambivalences. And to me, that was really what the project was about. It was sort of creating the experience for that to happen. And in that sense, I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to do that. What's next? I think those are the questions that you ask yourself after doing something like this. The project got a lot of attention while it was in Rome. It was in a few shows when it was over there. And it was a very rewarding experience, but also a very challenging one to work outside the traditional parameters of being a designer. It was gratifying, though, that the work was an end in itself. It wasn't in the service of something else or happening under the roof of something else. And I think that's one of the experiences that I went to go and have. It's fascinating. It's difficult. As simple as these seem, and as simple as this project sort of sounds like when I describe it, it was a very torturous experience to be someone who comes from such a formal background and such a comfort level with making really formal work. It was really hard and almost guilt-inspiring to produce stuff that it refused form, that was so minimal. And it was odd. It was really soul-searching to try to work that way. But to produce something on a really large scale, that was nice. And to think about design not as this sort of delicate, intricate, whispering work, but to think about it like it was yelling or like it was something that could be disruptive, that I found very gratifying and very rewarding. But time passes, and things fade. And only traces, if traces even, remain. And this is a photo of me shot by Eric Hyman He visited me when we went down to Sicily, and that's Mount Etna in the background. And, you know, as sad as it is to say, you got to go back to your life. And so I did. I came back to my life, and I'm running the studio, and that transition's been difficult. You know, you do something like this, and it's hard to go back to designing logos and building out websites for people. I mean, I don't mean to say that work's not interesting or rewarding, but it's one kind of work. And there are other kinds of work, apparently. And I think it made me think much more hard and long about what I want my work to be. And when I look back on my career as a creative individual, what I want to see. And I think it's not just work for clients. I think that there's another side, which is something that I'm much more committed to the idea of developing. And, you know, whether you want to call this work advocacy or confrontational or interventionist, I think at the end it creates opportunities for interpretation. And I look at that as a way to talk about or to get at a culture of inclusion. You know, to remind people that the way they think about something, that's what matters. The way they interpret something, that's what matters. People have a vote in making sense of the world that we live in. And I think that is a project that's worth committing to. And so, you know, whether it's called art or design, you can push open a space and make a doorway into some bigger ideas. And I think design is particularly suited to this because you don't need a gallery, you don't need a degree in art history, you don't need a lot of money, and the means to design are pretty accessible. So I like the trajectory or the simple way into that. And I think it's going to be an ongoing project for me. And I heard recently, I got some good news. I'm going to be a fellow at the Headlands Institute in summer 2012. And so I invite all of you to come up to my studio in Marin and check out whatever the next installment of this work is going to be. So if you will indulge me just for one more minute. Thank you. And maybe just a quick thank you to James Provenza, who worked really hard with me to put this lecture together and worked on these pieces and that sort of thing. So James, thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Yes, who would like to go first? David.
So why aren't you a fine artist?
Yeah, that's a question. I don't know, I'm uncomfortable with it. It's the legacy of being a designer.
What?
I think it's the legacy of being a designer. I think that I feel some responsibility to deliberateness, to communication, to an audience, and I feel like to embrace fine art, you somehow have to let that go, and I'm not able to, at least not at this point, and so I'm trying to find this middle ground between those two things, and you're wisely shaking your head. Yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. I'm not comfortable with that definition. But, you know, talk to me in a year. Let's see. And Rob, did you have a question? Or Carol?
What is SPQR?
Good question. SPQR, it stands for the Senate and People of Rome. And so anything that's owned by the Comune di Roma is branded by the SPQR logo. And if I knew any Latin, I could tell you exactly what the translation is, but I don't. Nick knows the answer.
It's Senatus Populis Quae Romanus. That's 7th grade
Right on. Thank you. Yes, Scott Hammond.
So where did you come up with the phrases that you ended up using? Like, did you have a notebook full of phrases, or did you pull them from the Futurist Manifesto, and why in English?
I never thought to do it in Italian. No. No. The phrases came from a bunch of places. So I tried to extract parts of different futurist pieces of work, and it didn't work. They were the language that they used, and that language in translation just was flowery and oddly romantic, and it didn't have this kind of open-ended resonance that I wanted. And so they came from two places. One, me just thinking them up, and two, doing some of that newspaper work where these odd things would kind of come together, and I'd say, hey, that has a good resonance to it. Maybe I can work on that. And I probably wrote about 1,000 phrases. And one of the hardest things, and it literally drove me insane, was to try to figure out what 5 to go with. And it was insanity. I had little images of those kiosks, and I cut out little posters to fit in, and then I would like walk along the wall of different ones. I go, maybe those should be together, and it just was stupid, And what's funny is that I think people got a little worried about me. Like, I really was like a zombie for a few days. I was probably my fellowship was 6 months, right? So that's probably worth knowing. If you go in design, you only get 6 months, whereas every other fellow gets 11 months. The thinking there is that designers have studios to go back to and run, and that more or less is the case. But with a 6-month window, I knew that I needed to make decisions much more quickly than a lot of the other people that I was there with. And so I really wanted to produce this project, and the city was crazy, and trying to get things printed in Italy, oddly enough, is not that easy to do. And so and everything works by cash, so that is anyway, won't go into that. So the phrases became difficult, and I went back through, and to this day, I really can't tell you why I chose those 5. I mean, they resonated for me there. They worked there. I look at other stuff now that I was doing, and I think, like, yeah, that might have been better. But you make your calls, and you go with it. As Donald Rumsfeld says, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you'd like to have. David?
So in developing that, how much feedback, critique did you have from other fellows? Or
Quite
were you in
a
a room by yourself?
No, I know myself enough to know that I work better if I talk about what I'm doing, and so I would periodically, or very often actually, invite people in to look and comment, and we would have discussions about stuff. After a while, that becomes crazy too, because at the end of the day, it's your instincts, and should there be 7? Should there be 9? What areas of Rome should we put them in? And no one has an answer, so you have to somehow come up with a series of parameters that make sense to you, and you hope for the best. Yeah, Nick.
It's interesting. I didn't realize the website had been set up to record people's reactions and comments. Did other reactions, like the ones actually on the street of people as they walk by, did those matter to you? Did you document those?
You know what? I mean, it's not, I can't know what people think, right? So it has to be expressed in some way. And so the expressions that I could track were on the website, what people wrote on the posters, and then the blogs. So there was a lot of traffic on Italian culture blogs where I could see what people were saying, how they were being interpreted, who they thought. I mean, I did this anonymously because what I didn't include in the lecture is that a lot of the pasting actually was done illegally. And so the city was unable to deliver, they couldn't police the installation spaces that they'd given me. So you would put a poster up, you come back a couple days later, Berlusconi had a poster up. Literally, his people. And so you'd go back and you'd have to do it again. And so the reason why I kept it anonymous because I didn't want to get the Academy into trouble and I didn't want to get deported, which would have been a different ending, right, to this lecture. Yeah.
How did you find the balance between like a strong point of view and leaving it more open for expression?
How did I arrive at that? I mean, it's good of you to say that I did arrive at that. I think, I like to think I did. I don't know. I mean, I think there's no good answer to that question. I think you kind of feel your way into it. These things evolved a lot. Like the phrase, the clock, was originally the earth, the clock. But it was too environmental, you know. It suggested immediately that it was an environmental project, and it was only partly about that. So I was always trying to ride the line between what would trigger interpretation in the right direction, but it wouldn't nail the interpretation down. And I think some of the experiments that I was making with more image-based stuff, that was something that became very clear to me, that, you know, language is kind of primary. We have a hugely developed center to process language, whereas to process graphics and imagery, it's much, much more diffuse. And so every time I would try to use something that was more image-based, it would spin the direction of the meaning off in a particular way that I didn't want. And so the idea of sticking with just the most basic linguistic approach, you know, and looking at how people like Lawrence Weiner and Jenny Holzer and people like that worked, those were big influences in, you know, helping me make those decisions. Anyone else? Yeah.
Sorry. Were you getting more traffic going to your website from the Google searches that you paid for those AdWords for, or was it more generating on blogs and on Facebook and stuff?
You might be better at reading analytics than I am. I don't know. You know, we got 20,000 hits in 30 days, which was pretty good, and the site recorded about 800 comments. So, but I never figured out how to check, you know, what's coming from what source or anything like that. Dennis Crow.
So what about your work in 2012? Is this going to inform what you do, or is it going in a different direction, or what are you thinking?
I don't know. You know, this poster that I did for this show or this lecture, it's still dealing with language. You know, it's still very much trying to think about language as a doorway to personal interpretation, and I'm still somewhat committed to that. I don't think that's run its course for me yet. What's been difficult is to go back to the more formal work that I was doing before. It feels like really disingenuous in a way, like it feels wrong to start trying to make work like that. And I mean, for me, I don't mean for anyone else. And so that's a problem, because that's sometimes why people hire me. So it's like, how about these words, like, instead of that stuff that you like? That hasn't worked so well yet. Yeah, Michael.
That was my question. It seems like you see these as two separate worlds. I either do commercial work or I do this. Is there a way that you can allow this work to inform the commercial work without feeling like, I guess, you're selling out or angst or whatever it is? I mean, is there a way to lead your clients to sort of be much more experimental in the way they get their message talked about? Or, I mean,
I wouldn't want to leave anyone with the impression that I would privilege one commercial work over non-commercial work. You know, I know that it might sound that way in the way that I'm talking about it, but I don't mean that. And you know, there probably is a good way. You know, there probably is a way to find a middle ground. Unfortunately, what I'm finding in my business is that we're hired mostly now to do web interactive and identity projects. And as far as messaging and strategy work, we're not getting that kind of work. And so there's a very good place to take that kind of thinking in more strategic thinking and messaging thinking, but no one seems to be coming to me for that. And from what I hear, talking to my friends who run studios, that work is all going to strategy agencies, and then those agencies sort of find someone to mess around with the design aspect of it. And
someone like Sagmeister, his personal work that he takes that year off finds its way into commercial venues, and and I guess that's the analogy I was trying to make, is that his experimentation gets clients attracted to whatever that weirdness is, right?
And he goes for it.
And he goes.
Yeah, that's probably a really good way to look at it. We'll see. We'll see. I feel like you go away for 6 months and you do lose some clients in there. And the AIA, for instance, who we were doing all that really expressive poster work, they don't even do print anymore. And so the idea of printing a poster to them, they're like, oh man, that's just going to seem wasteful to our constituency. And a print-based graphic designer, that's worrying, right? It's like, what? No one needs print anymore. It's probably the way I'm going to try to look at it and try to find clients who are interested in that space. Haven't found them yet, so if you've got some that you want to cut loose, you know where to find me. Anyone else? Yeah, Moira.
I want to go back to what you were talking about as far as like being sort of isolated on the hill and thinking about the city down below. When you were taking the next step to actually go and install these, could you talk a little bit about the little details on that, like your crew and how it was when you were actually physically, when they were actually being posted and people walking by, and if there was like discourse and people wanting to know, and how you handled that as far as not speaking the language.
Right. It's an involved answer. The plan was that the Comune di Roma would do everything. And so all I had to do was deliver printed posters to them like any advertiser. And there was a backstory where when I originally presented the project to them, they're like, oh yeah, this is interesting, imagine this in Italian. This is interesting, we think it's cool. When you come there with the Academy's sort of stamp of approval, they take you seriously, so that, not like here. So that was interesting. But they said, we'll sponsor this and we'll help you produce this, but you have to put our logo on it. So they wanted to put the SPQR logo on the poster. And the designer in me is like, oh, well, no problem, we put logos on things all the time, so how can that be a big deal? But before I said anything, I go, well, let me go back and look at it, and it became really clear to me that if I did that, the criticality of the project would be over. So I said, no, I can't do it, and they said, well, then we're not sure if we can patronize this project, and I had to go to another office and deal with a bunch of other people, and ultimately they green-lighted it. But what I said before, they couldn't police the space. So I would go to the media buy that they'd given me, and it would be there one day and literally the next gone. And so I hooked up with a guy who owns a bar in this part of Rome called Pignetto, which is like the cool hip bar, and he's in a band and all this sort of stuff. And he had friends, and so the guy who knows a guy kind of thing. And we put a crew together, and we would go out and do a lot of wheat pasting. And so that part, this was kind of an interesting lesson. And anyone here who wants to do this sort of thing, there's a few things you think that are wrong. One, go during the day. Don't go at night. Because if you go at night, no one's around, and the police know you're up to no good. Whereas if it's during the day, maybe you're just someone who gets paid to do this. And so we would always go in the afternoon. So we would go, and we had a route where we would go through one zone and then another zone on one day, and then the next day we would do another section. And the other great thing is that wheat pasting is a sort of chemical reaction between wheat, water, and some kind of agent that had an Italian name on it that I don't know what it was. But if you mix it up in a bucket with water, it works. And Rome has water fountains, public water fountains everywhere. So water is never a problem. So you make up a big batch of this, and you can always kind of extend it to do what you need to do. And we never got caught, and we got asked for a lot of posters. So when we would be out on the street, people say, oh, can I have one of those? So we gave a lot away, and people would come up to us saying, "Oh, this is for the Green Party, right?" Or this is some kind of ironic Berlusconi critique. I mean, Scott asked a question earlier, why is it in English? The original plan was to do it half in English, half in Italian. But as I started to investigate that, Berlusconi's latest sex scandal erupted, and it would have been subsumed in the media storm of this anti-Berlusconi stuff. And so it was decided by me and the people I was using as advisors, like, if you do it in English, it separates way more. People see it as a sort of outside voice coming into the culture as opposed to something that's part of the internal culture. So I know that's a way more and less of an answer than you wanted, but hopefully that goes some way to clarify that. Anyone else? Yeah, back here, sorry.
Yeah, so aside from the implications on your work, I'm just curious if this experience has changed the way you think or feel about the future, about life, like just personally, just being somewhere for 6 months and doing something like this.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean, a couple answers to that question. One thing is that David Hecht, who's here, told me about the Rome Prize, I don't know, 8 years ago or something like that. We were talking about it. And it put it on my radar, but I never thought about doing it until I met someone who was a fellow, and I thought, like, you know what, I could apply for that. I didn't think I would get it. And I think that as far as changing your life a little bit, you can't win if you don't apply for something. And I met people who were fellows who'd applied 12 times and gotten it. And it made me feel like such a wimp, because it's like, wow, if I hadn't gotten it that time, I probably would have said, well, it's not going to happen, and I'll move on. I'll do something else. And if I hadn't applied for that, I wouldn't have applied for this Headlands residency thing. And so, in a way, the idea that you can crack these nuts, if you apply yourself and you think about it and you kind of try to think about what the system is there, I think that's a change for me. As far as the existential and philosophical change, yeah, I mean, I worry about the fact that we're reminded all the time of the impossibility of our situation, and we do nothing. That does worry me, but I think, like, everyone in the room agrees with me, I think, unfortunately, or I don't know, fortunately, I'm just preaching to the choir here. But I do wonder that. I mean, I had a student the other day working on a project about water consumption. He's like, well, yeah, it was interesting. I found out that in the city of San Francisco, we only have about a 20-year supply of water before we have a real problem. 20 years? Like, that's surprising. And I thought, when's the last time I even looked at a water bill? I mean, not in a long time. My housemate, Cesar, who's here, he looks at those. So thank you for that, by the way. Do I owe you some money? Is that what you said? But that thing, yeah. I mean, I think a lot about it, and I think that we're so committed and so to a particular way of life that relies on a certain access and takes for granted a lot. I think that's our biggest problem, and I think that we don't know how to make sacrifice, and I don't think we're going to learn. And so I think that it will be something that's forced on us. And I know that that's a pretty sour thing to say, but it's actually what I believe. There's the up note for the evening. Someone else had a question over here. Anyone else?
You mentioned how when designing you appreciate the process, but when you display your portfolio, it doesn't show that. So how do you go about showing your clients or showing the general audience about your process? And when you look at your final pieces, do you admire or do you appreciate more the process or the final piece that you're looking at?
Well, I'm trying to be more like Michael Vanderbilt and only show one design and say, this is what you have to buy. Isn't that what you do? That hasn't worked well for me, actually. So the process, I mean, I don't know. I guess I see two different answers there. I think when you're doing really experimental work, there is a lot of process because you're just trying to figure out what should it look like, and then once you understand the formal language, how do you manipulate it to do what you need it to do, and that fills up books of sketchbooks with junk. I don't say junk, with stuff, and a lot of clients don't want to see that. They're confused by it. And I remember once we had a client where they looked at our portfolio and they loved it and they hired us and they just hated everything we did after that. And it's the first and only time, knock on what appears to be wood but isn't, that I've ever been fired from a job. And I thought, okay, here's the answer. I'm going to show that guy all the process, why we arrived at the answers we've arrived at, and it will expose the logic, and all will be well with the world. And we did that, and I put this book together, and I showed it to him, and I heard through someone else, the guy's like, these guys don't have any idea what they're doing. Look at all this stuff. It's like it's totally undirected, and like it's just random. And then they hired Bob Awfuldish, and I think he did a great job. And so, you got to ask Bob. Maybe he's got the answer that I don't have. So I think the short and relevant answer to your question is that I think you engineer the process that you show. And so you make it, I hate to say this, at least what I do, you make it seem more streamlined and more ordered and more logical than it often is. And that they seem to respond to well. You make it seem like it's the logical conclusion of this road you've been going down. And then it kind of sells itself if you do it right. Anything else? I think that's a no. Well, I want to again thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's a rare honor to speak to people who you are friends with and admire and have known for a long time. So thank you again. If you want a poster, there's a bunch up here. You can have the ones that are on the front of the hall here. And for the students in the room, there's a likelihood that Eric Hyman and I are going to run a summer program to either Berlin or Cuba this summer. And so if you're interested in that, talk to us. Thank you very much. Have a great night. I hope to see you all soon.